The legislative session in Albany is scheduled to conclude in just a couple of weeks, and one of the final bills to be introduced is Governor Cuomo's Parent Choice in Education Act. This legislation would provide a tax credit for families who make up to $60,000 a year to send their children to non-public schools, including religious ones. It will also give a 75% tax credit for donations made to such scholarships for such schools.
Well, opponents see this as a huge tax break for the rich that siphons needed funds from our already struggling public education system. Here to give us more details about this bill and their opinions as to whether or not this will help or hurt our students in New York State are Laura Zingmond. She's the senior editor at Inside Schools. Thanks for joining us, Laura. We're also happy to welcome Zakiyah Ansari, advocacy director with the Alliance for Quality Education. Thanks for joining us. And from the Micah Institute at New York Theological Seminary, its educational director, the Reverend Raymond Blanchet. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Yeah.
I'm well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a very, very important topic for us. And Laura, why don't you start us off with breaking down the tax credit?
Well, the tax credit has 4 different components to it, and it's been rebranded. It was, I believe, the Education Investment Incentives Act, which didn't pass Senate, and so they rebranded it and actually shifted more of the money to non-public school attendance, so it's even more of a disparity than before. And the bulk of it, the overwhelming majority of the money tax credits set aside goes to credits to individual families, low-income families, to who send their kids to non-public schools, and for scholarships for private investors to invest money in scholarships to attend private schools. And then there is a much smaller component, $10 million for public school teachers, and that includes charters, they can put in for a $200 a year tax credit for supplies for their classroom. And the other component, I believe it's 20 million or something like that, up to 20 million donations to organizations that support public schools. And just to put in context, so you can imagine, I think it's like 130,000 is for the non-public, support of the non-public school attendance, and a much smaller amount. And I'm sure Zakiyah can also mention this, comment on this a lot further, but the state still owes public schools billions of dollars, and they're already shifting money to that.
Okay.
So before we do go into that, Zakiyah, just to sort of frame the argument a little bit more, one of the things that stuck with me was tax deduction versus tax credit, because it's easy to like just go down the road, but there is a difference between a tax deduction and a tax credit.
So, I mean, I think what this is and what we need to expose is that I think, you know, we can talk nice about this as is, but this is an exact coordinated campaign to privatize our schools. It's an exact coordinated campaign to make sure that those who are wealthy and wealthy beyond their means continue to gain more wealth. And at the same time, guess what? We're going to give you a tax credit on that money as well. And what we've seen in the recent Siena poll that shows that found that 49% of voters are opposed to this tax credit. So whether the governor wants to call it some new fancy name, Parental Education and Choice Act, right? Because it sounds good and it's a scheme.
Everyone believes in choice for education.
Oh yeah, well that's a whole nother show that we should talk about. Yeah. Absolutely. But what this does not do is there's no transparency in regards to it, right? It does not support the most neediest schools. Even in the private institution, it will not incentivize those folks who are rich already and who can already afford to send their kids to $40,000 schools like Fieldston, right? To then be able to get a scholarship on top of that, which they could already afford. So why would they need scholarships? Also, that the writing is on the wall. We've seen what's happened in Georgia in regards to the students that this actually absolutely supports. It's not the children that we need these these credits, quote unquote, to support. Right. It's not going to our children. It's not going to the most neediest districts. It's not going to the most neediest schools. And I think numero uno, it's unconstitutional.
And to be clear, a tax deduction is something that we might relate to where if you get a Metro card through your company, they take your Metro card every month out of your pre-tax pay. So if you get a $40 Metro card, they'll take $40 out so it reduces the amount of income that you get. Versus a tax credit means at the end of the year when all is said and done, from the bottom line of you owe $1,000 to us, you have a credit for $700. You automatically owe us $3 now.
Yeah, that's correct. You have, it goes against it, the deduction goes against adjusted gross income versus the credit, which is actually you get
money.
it's free money that you get at the end of the year. It's money they're giving you.
Right.
And just to point out that these organizations that are wealthy individuals, because up to $1 million tax credit, you can get. They already get tax deduction. If you donate to a nonprofit organization, you'll get a tax deduction just like any of us would. And they will still get the federal tax deduction, so their federal income will be adjusted down by it. And on top of that, rather than a state deduction, it'll now shift to the much better credit. And for state taxes, if you owe $1 million in state taxes, you're very wealthy, and that's an incredible amount of money. And
it's too cute by half, the bottom line. Yeah.
So what's your stance on this issue?
Well, the bottom line becomes, again, it's too cute by half. Deduction versus credit. If the governor was really serious about funding education in the state of New York, why not have a tax credit for families who want to give money towards public education? How about doing something where we're saying, well, we know we owe the city of New York $2.5 billion, right, to fully fund public education. Why don't we put together a tax credit, right, education investment tax credit towards that, where it will go directly towards education? They're not doing that. So whether it's a deduction, whether it's a credit, it's two sides of the same disgusting coin. The bottom line becomes that he is not interested in funding public education, and the question becomes why? Why are you funding private, parochial, and charter schools, which is a whole other kettle of fish that we haven't even, discussed yet? Why are you funding private education when people already have the money to pay $35,000, $40,000 in tuition? They're paying more in tuition for a public school than they're paying actually to go to a lot of colleges, particularly CUNY or SUNY schools, right? So why are you giving them a tax credit to do that when they're wealthy already? Parochial schools. You mean to tell me that the Archdiocese of New York has been suffering for years, and the other organizations out there that are saying, oh yes, this is so wonderful, and it funds poor kids, like the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they have schools. All these institutions out there, they have schools. And they've been suffering. They say, you know what, we'll take that money. Yeah, this is a great idea.
But to be sure, every student who attends a parochial or private school is not from a family sitting on a pile of money. And
it doesn't matter.
Can see
1.3 million children are not receiving a dynamic education in the city of New York right now. This is what's the issue. It's not whether or not we're dealing with, the way you were framing it is the way the governor wants you to frame it. To have you, look at, these kids, they're not wealthy.
Yeah.
We're talking about a drop in the bucket.
But if we're saying a family that makes $60,000 a year, at the end of the year gets a $500 credit towards sending their kid to a private or parochial school, that's not even Metro cards for half a year. So that's not a lot of money that the state is doling out to give to these kids. So what would your argument be against that?
What's the objective? The objective is the objective to send kids to private, parochial, and charter schools, or is the objective to fund public education?
Isn't the objective to give all students a quality education?
Well, we haven't even reached our
we
priority.
Haven't reached that
we
yet.
haven't prioritized and our commitment through a lawsuit that said New York State children were supposed to be provided a sound-based education. And so if we know funding is already precious, and we have yet to really fully fund and try equity, we have yet to try equity, not only in the state, but in this country, but the governor is the first one to say, you know what, we put in 3 times as much into public schools. What equity means is maybe you need to put 5 times as much because poverty is up. Right? Because children and families are receiving a living wage, right? Because of a whole host of things. That's equity. And that's the conversation that we're not talking about. The other piece is What we've seen around the country, and because this is a kind of voucher, and what we've seen, as I shared in Georgia, is that there was the same kind of commitment to ensure that schools and children who are not necessarily in rich private schools, but other schools have a tax credit. And what we've seen, right, in regards to the writing being on the wall, that's not what happened. Like the money the people that received credits and scholarships were the very folks who could afford the $40,000, right? The very folks who we were trying to make sure we were educating in those schools, in some of those Catholic schools where many Latino children attend, or other schools, or churches who have schools, was those schools didn't get the funding, right? It was the rich, upper middle class folks that were receiving those fundings and those scholarships. So the question becomes, we already know what this is going to look like. Incentivizing me to put in money for a tax credit, I don't have $1 million. But guess what? There's a short window of opportunity to apply for these. There's a certificate that needs to be provided. I'm an average Joe. I'm trying to struggle, scrimp and save. Every family member is putting their money together. I don't have time for 2 weeks between January 1st and 15th to get my certificate number. And then what am I going to put in? It's not going to be $1 million, right? And so those corporations and others and individuals who can have one business here, another business here, and another business here, all under a different name, absolutely can get that credit.
What's the alternative then? If we can say to the governor, this plan doesn't work, what is a viable alternative? We have a mayoral control fight brewing between the mayor and the governor now over the city schools. And if we're talking about choice, parents can't even choose what school they send their kids to in the city right now. I couldn't send my kid to 231 in Brooklyn, like everyone wants to get into this school. So what are the alternatives? 321.
Fully fund public education. We have a chancellor who's an incredibly seasoned educator who really can walk into a school and know immediately what's working, what's not. And she has a better record than probably most chancellors anywhere in the country. And if you give her the funds, the support with parent and public input, real input, it can work. But we are way below funding. And before we start giving money, and also the idea of giving every kid a quality education. First of all, you can choose your choice to send to a school, and let's be clear, at least in New York City, the overwhelming percentage of kids who go to non-public schools go to religious schools, which is why people are saying this is starting to sound unconstitutional, because the governor has been unabashed in his support for promotion of kids going to religious schools. Personally, on a personal preference, that's fine. There are a lot of good religious schools. There are a lot of not so good religious schools, and are not giving kids quality education. And there is no test for whether those schools should benefit from this, and that's problematic. And when the governor, an elected official in the United States with the First Amendment, establishing a clear preference for supporting attendance in religious schools, this gets very uncomfortable.
Right, definitely. I mean, whatever happened to separation of church and state, right? We asked that question. So what do you think in terms of this bill actually passing, right? You mentioned that you didn't think there were 49% of people were against it. Is it going to get passed in the Assembly? What do you think?
I mean, what we've been doing as the Alliance for Quality Education is really making sure that doesn't happen through advocacy. Reverend Blanchett could talk to, as a matter of fact, of him going up there in the letter that that clergy from Micah Institute. So it's about us being out there, making the phone calls to our assembly members. If we believe that public education has been underfunded over the last however many years, then we should not be supporting this education tax credit. If we believe and we can see clearly that those who hedge fund billionaires have gotten their dirty, grubby hands into Albany, then we should not be supporting this education tax credit. If you look at these commercials that have doubled and tripled in over the period of time and are getting worse, and don't think that that money is coming from somewhere. It's cost millions of dollars to run these campaigns, right? If we're looking at those, don't believe the hype. Call your assembly member today. Tell them if they're standing strong and they haven't signed a tax credit, say stand strong and we support you. If they have signed on, tell them to get their names off of that and really prioritize the funding of public schools. The majority of children attend our public schools, and we have yet to prioritize the funding or prioritize them as the space. Public school is too big and too important to fail.
How much does the state owe New York City public schools at the moment?
$2.5 billion, the state 5.9.
You cannot scuttle public education and then blame kids for not succeeding. And that's basically what is happening. They are scuttling public education. They're choosing to give dollars to institutions that don't look like us, that don't understand what it really means to have a strong desire to send your children to school, to obtain an education, and not have those resources. Forget about issues of co-location, et cetera. Yesterday, when we were talking with the Black and Latino Legislative Caucus in Albany, and we sat down with Kathy Nolan, the chairman of the Education Committee for the State Assembly. They were very, very strong in their opposition, but what they're saying is that the governor and his allies, they are coming at them very, very heavy. It's harassment. They are protesting in front of their offices. They are protesting with these robocalls. They're calling them all these names, trying to, and even getting really nasty, like, for example, Rodney's Bichot in Brooklyn, who represents Flatbush, who took over for Rhoda Jacobs, trying to put a wedge in the community between the African American and the Jewish community. So it's really, really, really getting nasty out there, and we need to educate ourselves. We need to understand what's really going on here, and we need to unite and say that we want a full, basic, sound education for 1.3 million children in our system today.
Okay, well, I think we're going to have to wrap on that note. But thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.